Today's Postville Courthouse is a reconstruction of the original 8th Judicial Circuit Courthouse. Abraham Lincoln argued legal cases in the old Postville Courthouse from 1841 or 42 until 1848.
Lincoln was one of several lawyers and judges who rode the circuit. For about a dozen years, Lincoln left his Springfield law office in March and September to practice law on the 8th Judicial Circuit.
In 1840, the 8th Judicial Circuit included 8 counties. In 1845, it was enlarged to 15 Illinois counties and covered more than 11,000 square miles, almost one-fourth of the state. The circuit judges and lawyers stopped to try cases in each county.
It was a difficult journey. There were no railroads until the 1850s. Lawyers and judges rode horses or drove the rutted, dusty roads in buggies. It was often necessary to swim flooded rivers because the bridges had washed out. On a good day, in good weather, they could travel 4 miles an hour.
When they arrived at the county seats, there were different kinds of hardships. Hotel accommodations ranged from wretched all the way up to cheerless and uncomfortable.
In his book, Life on the Circuit with Lincoln, Henry Clay Whitney described a typical hotel room. Men slept 2 to a bed, with 3 or 4 beds to a room. There was barely enough space for the bed bugs, ticks, and lice.
The food ranged from unspeakable to merely greasy. Judge David Davis said the food was often barely fit for the stomach of a horse.
Accommodations and the bill of fare weren't of the highest quality, but they weren't expensive either. One of Lincoln's fellow attorneys recalled that supper, lodging, and breakfast for him and Lincoln, as well as feeding and stabling their horses, cost them a grand total of 75 cents.
Observers noted that while his colleagues complained constantly, Lincoln never seemed to be bothered by bad food or cramped lodging. It was probably no worse than he had experienced growing up in a frontier log cabin. Lincoln didn't mind sharing a bed or eating plain food. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it.
Life on the circuit wasn't all hardship. The judges and lawyers were celebrities. Parties and receptions were held in their honor. The arrival of the circuit riders was a social event. People from miles around came to town to watch the goings-on in court. Evenings and weekends were spent telling stories, arguing politics, or attending local entertainments.
Lincoln, Judge Samuel Treat, and the others who rode the circuit were young men at the time. They were all fond of amusements and even practical jokes. Lincoln was the center of lively late-night storytelling sessions.
Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, wrote, "Life on the circuit was a gay one. It was rich with incidents and afforded the nomadic lawyers ample relaxation from all the irksome toil that fell to their lot." Lincoln loved it.
When it was time to go to work, the circuit lawyers were intelligent men with a keen understanding of the law and the ability to think on their feet. Illinois Supreme Court Justice John D. Caton wrote, "The circuit required a quickness of thought and rapidity of action nowhere else requisite in professional practice. The lawyer would scarcely alight from his horse when he would be surrounded by 2 or 3 clients requiring his services. Then perhaps he would be called on to assist in a trial. This required one to think quickly, make no mistakes, and to take advantage of the mistakes of the adversary, who was probably similarly situated."
The average person didn't have much money to pay legal fees. Payment ranged from barter items such as a horse Lincoln once received to something that might be traded for lodging or meals at the local tavern, to part of the land won in a settlement.
When he practiced law at Postville, Abraham Lincoln was making the transition from a junior law partner to a seasoned attorney. Records of Lincoln's court cases at the Postville Courthouse were destroyed by fire in 1857. Most of them probably had to do with property division, civil disagreements, boundary disputes, stray livestock, and debts. Occasionally, Lincoln might have been involved in a criminal case.
Lincoln was also politically active during the Postville years. He sought the Whig nomination to Congress in 1843 and 1844, finally getting the nomination in 1846. He was elected to Congress and went to Washington in 1847.
The courtroom at Postville is representative of the original 1840s courtroom. Even though it's very small by today's standards, it was big enough for everyone who had to be there. As for the spectators, circuit court was a social event. People apparently didn't mind jamming themselves into a small room to watch the proceedings.
Postville was centrally located in Logan County, but Mount Pulaski had the most people and proprietors who promised to build a bigger and better courthouse. In an 1847 referendum, the Logan County voters chose to move the county seat to Mount Pulaski. The Postville Courthouse was sold at auction for $300. It was used by community and religious groups until around 1880, when it was remodeled and became a private residence.
In 1914, Timothy Beach bought the building and tried without success for 15 years to sell it to various local groups who he thought should preserve it for its historical significance.
In 1929, Henry Ford was nearly finished building his outdoor museum called Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford had already moved several historic buildings to Greenfield Village. In August, he learned from a former Lincoln, Illinois resident that a courthouse associated with Abraham Lincoln's law career might be available. He sent someone to investigate the Postville Courthouse, and he bought it a few days later.
As soon as local residents heard Ford intended to move the courthouse to Michigan instead of restoring it on site, the Postville Courthouse became more important to the community than it had been for decades. Mrs. Beach told Ford he couldn't move the building even if he did own it, and a Logan County judge, Lawrence Stringer, suggested legal action to keep the building in Lincoln.
Henry Ford came to Lincoln to talk with the local residents before making a final decision to move the building. When he arrived, Ford stopped to inspect the courthouse, then met with Mrs. Beach and had lunch with Judge Stringer.
After their meeting, Mrs. Beach told Henry Ford he owned the building and could move it if he wanted to. Judge Stringer remained opposed to Ford's plan. He said the building would be meaningless and an empty shell if it were moved. Ford countered by saying that the old courthouse was in such poor shape that it would become an empty shell on its own in a few more years.
Ford's argument also focused on money. The community couldn't afford to preserve the courthouse, and he could. Despite local resistance, Ford went ahead with his plan to move the building.
The Lincoln Courier said, regardless of the sentimental feeling toward the old building, the community is unprepared to preserve the landmark. Everyone should rejoice that Henry Ford will see to it that the courthouse will be preserved and dignified for years to come.
On September 6, 1929, a work crew arrived to dismantle the Postville Courthouse. 10 days later, the roof and chimneys were off, the weatherboarding had been removed, and the framing was loaded on railroad cars. In the interest of preserving as much of the original building as possible, the workmen even saved the nails and ground up the plaster.
The grand opening of Ford's Greenfield Village had been set for late October in 1929, long before Ford even knew about the Postville Courthouse. The Postville Courthouse restoration schedule was extremely tight. An actor portraying Abraham Lincoln greeted President Herbert Hoover, Thomas Edison, and 400 other notables as they toured the restored courthouse when Greenfield Village celebrated its grand opening, October 21, 1929.
The building you see here today is a reconstruction. It's based on drawings and plans of the original building, which was moved by Henry Ford in 1929. Reconstruction began in 1953 and was completed in 1955.
Postville was one of Lincoln's stops on his way to becoming the 16th president. Abraham Lincoln's political career was rooted in the contacts he made while riding the 8th Judicial Circuit.
William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, said, "Lincoln's restless ambition found its gratification only in the field of politics. He used the law merely as a stepping stone to what he considered a more attractive condition in the political world."
The circuit was fertile political ground where ideas and ideals were taking shape. Illinois was a growing and influential state at a time when many different opinions were being voiced, when history was changing course, and a time when a new national political leader named Abraham Lincoln was about to emerge.